Jack the Ripper. Sir Donald had returned to his sprawling country estate in Somerset after a long period away in London. His duties with the government kept him constantly occupied, and since the death of his wife 2 years prior, the house had become eerily quiet. His children, now grown, had all left home. Only Edward, his youngest son, remained. He had been especially close to his mother, and her sudden death had left him a shadow of the boy he once was. His father, though present, felt like a distant figure. One evening, Sir Donald was greeted at the door by Edward's nanny, a look of fear in her eyes. "What is it this time?" he asked wearily. He killed the groundsman's dog," she said, voice trembling. Sir Donald exhaled sharply. "Give the groundsman some money and buy him a new dog. Send Edward to my office." The incidents had been happening more and more often. Edward's anger, his cruelty, these were things Sir Donald could no longer ignore. Years passed, and it seemed that Edward's fascination with cruelty had shifted. He no longer needed to hurt animals. The darkness inside him had grown, evolved. Now he was focused on something far more sinister. He'd begun to feel a strange thrill in the quiet streets of London, lurking where the shadows swallowed up the weak and the forgotten. London in the late 1800s was a place of stark contrasts. The streets teemed with people, the wealthy adorned in fine suits and elegant gowns, while the poor lived in the choking haze of the East End, where factories belched smoke and grime clouded the air. Edward, ever the student, was studying human anatomy at the Royal College of Surgeons. His fascination with the human body bordered on obsession, though perhaps it wasn't the body he was truly interested in, but the way he could control it, twist it, break it. His appearance was normal enough, and he had many acquaintances. But his mind, his thoughts, betrayed him. He grew disgusted with the working class, believing their filth and crime were a blight on the city. "They're nothing but parasites, feeding off the system," he would say, his voice soft, but his eyes cold. The city would be better off without them. William, his only true friend, disagreed. Coming from a humble background, he found value in the working class, the very people Edward despised. Without them, London wouldn't run, William would argue. They build the city. Edward would always smile darkly, almost mockingly. They only build it to tear it down. You've never seen the filth in their eyes. I've seen it. I know it. I don't know what you mean, William would reply uneasily, but there was an unsettling glimmer in Edward's eyes. He would speak of how the city was crumbling, how the crime was spreading, how the working class mobs were rising up like a plague. Sometimes, when he spoke, it felt as if he were describing something more than just societal decay. It felt as if he were speaking of a solution. "There's a sickness in them, William," he would whisper late at night. "Maybe the only way to save the city is to cut the disease out." William, unsettled, tried to shake the thought from his mind, but it lingered, like a shadow in the corner of his consciousness. One evening, they attended a theatre performance together, but William was distracted. He couldn't stop thinking about Edward's words, the murderers, the mutilations, the rumors that were beginning to surface about the crimes in Whitechapel. He couldn't help but think back to a disturbing moment in class when Edward had produced something wrong. It had been a kidney, freshly removed, and Edward had claimed it was from a deceased patient. But William knew. He knew there was something off about Edward's explanation, and as the performance continued, it became clear. Edward wasn't just a friend. He was something darker, something other. During intermission, William went to the restroom. There, by chance, he encountered Edward's father, Sir Donald, who had been seated in a private box. "I didn't realize you knew my son," Sir Donald remarked, his voice as cold and polished as his demeanor. We've been friends for years," William replied, still rattled. Sir Donald eyed him, his gaze piercing. Edward is an overachiever. He has always been driven. William hesitated before speaking, the words heavy on his tongue. Sir, there's something I need to ask you. I need to know. What if your son is involved in the murders in Whitechapel? Sir Donald's expression shifted in an instant. His smile vanished. What nonsense are you talking about? He hissed, his voice dangerously low. The next morning, still troubled, William went to the police. He had no concrete proof, only a dark suspicion that gnawed at him. But the police, controlled by Sir Donald's influence, took no action. In fact, it was William who was arrested, falsely accused and silenced. That night, Edward prepared to leave, wearing a dark coat and a black tie. His eyes were hollow, his every movement deliberate as he left his father's house. The streets of East London had grown even darker, the air thick with the stench of crime and decay. It was here, in the silent corners of the city, where Edward now moved like a predator. One evening, he approached a woman, a prostitute standing alone by a darkened alley. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice soft and cold. Before she could respond, he silenced her with a sudden vicious movement, his hand swift and practiced as he sliced her neck. In the darkness, he vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving nothing behind but a faint echo of his presence. The murders continued, but they were no longer just random killings. They bore the signature of someone with an intimate knowledge of the human body, someone who understood it, who could disassemble it with surgical precision. Yet the police could find no trace, no solid evidence to link the crimes together. The city lived in terror, and the whispers of a Jack the Ripper grew louder. William, finally released from jail, was confronted by Sir Donald. The Prime Minister's voice was sharp, commanding. "You will say nothing. There is evidence now. A blade, a diary. It all points to Edward. But I will handle it. He will be safe in my estate in Somerset. If you speak a word of this to anyone, I will ruin you." Terrified, William stayed silent. He knew that the man he had once called a friend was now something else. The rumors began to spread. Jack the Ripper was Edward, but without concrete evidence, they remained only whispers, fear feeding on itself. The killing slowed, but elsewhere, in the quiet fields of Somerset, young girls began disappearing, just as they had in London. William was too afraid to confront his past, never spoke Edward's name again. He wondered, in the deep recesses of his mind, how his old friend was faring. Years later, as William neared death, he finally took the pen and wrote down the truth about Jack the Ripper, the truth about Edward, the end